The air in the Golden Anchor, a gleaming bastion of opulence nestled in the heart of Boston's waterfront, was heavy with the scent of wealth and power. A heady mix of aged whiskey, bespoke cologne, and the faint, briny tang of seared lobster tail. For Emily Harper, a 23-year-old waitress who moved through its dimly lit expanse with the precision of a seasoned dancer, it mostly smelled like exhaustion. Each clink of crystal glassware against polished silver was a tick of the clock counting down the final agonizing minutes of her double shift. Her feet ached in the stiff black flats she wore. Her crisp black uniform clung to her skin, with the sweat of 8 hours spent weaving between tables, balancing trays laden with plates of caviar-dusted scallops and glasses of vintage Bordeaux. The Golden Anchor wasn't just a restaurant. It was a stage where Boston's elite performed their nightly rituals of dominance and decadence, their voices a low hum of deal-making and self-congratulation. Emily was part of the invisible machinery, a ghost in a starched apron trained to anticipate desires before they were spoken to, refill a glass or clear a plate, with such seamless grace that her presence barely registered. Tonight, her section was graced by Richard Langley, a man whose face was a fixture on the covers of Forbes and Wired, a titan of technology whose net worth could rebuild entire cities. As she poured sparkling water into his glass with practiced steadiness, he slid a sleek leather-bound portfolio across the mahogany table toward his 3 impeccably dressed dinner guests, revealing a single laminated page, a schematic that he claimed was the genesis of his empire. In that moment, Emily's world tilted, because in the bottom right corner of the yellowed paper in a familiar flowing script was a signature she hadn't seen in 12 years. Dr. Sarah Bennett, her mother, a woman who had vanished from her life when Emily was just 11. The Golden Anchor was more than a workplace for Emily. It was a crucible where her dreams had been forged into something harder, more practical. 2 years ago, she had been a star student at MIT, her mind alight with the possibilities of quantum mechanics. Her future, a bright arc toward a career in theoretical physics. A full scholarship had carried her to Cambridge, where she thrived in lecture halls filled with equations that danced like poetry in her mind. Then came the call that shattered everything her father, Michael Harper, had been diagnosed with a rare autoimmune disorder, one that drained his strength and piled medical bills higher than their modest savings could bear. The scholarship covered tuition, not hospital stays or experimental treatments, so Emily made the choice to leave MIT trading her textbooks for a waitress's apron and her ambitions for the relentless reality of rent payments and prescription costs. She moved back to their small apartment in South Boston, a cramped space filled with the ghosts of a happier past, and took the best-paying job she could find without a degree. The Golden Anchor paid well better than any diner or coffee shop, but it demanded everything: her time, her energy, her pride. Her life had become a loop of early mornings, checking on her father's breathing long bus rides to the waterfront, the exhausting ballet of service under the watchful eyes of the restaurant's manager, Mr. Caldwell, and late nights poring over her mother's old research papers, trying to keep the spark of her own intellect alive. Those papers were all she had left of Dr. Sarah Bennett, a brilliant physicist whose work on sustainable energy had once promised to change the world. Sarah had been Emily's hero, a woman who could unravel the mysteries of the universe while still finding time to braid her daughter's hair and tell her bedtime stories about black holes and supernovae. 12 years ago, when Emily was 11, Sarah had disappeared. The official report said she'd driven her car off a cliff near Cape Ann, a tragic accident attributed to overwork and stress. No body was ever found, only a vague note about pressure and failure. The police closed the case, but Emily never believed it. Her mother was a fighter, a woman whose optimism burned brighter than the stars she studied. She wouldn't have just given up. Tonight, the restaurant was buzzing with its usual crowd hedge fund managers, tech moguls, and old-money Bostonians who treated the staff like furniture. Emily moved through her section with mechanical efficiency, her face a mask of professional neutrality. "More wine, sir," she'd ask, her voice soft, but clear, her eyes never lingering too long. She was good at her job, too good. Mr. Caldwell often said, though, his compliments always carried a patronizing edge. Richard Langley's table was the centerpiece of her section, a corner booth with a view of the harbor reserved for the kind of guest who didn't need to ask for the best seat. Langley was in his late 50s, tall and lean with silver hair and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He had the effortless charisma of a man who knew he could buy loyalty and the arrogance of one who had never been told no. His company, Langley Innovations, had revolutionized the energy sector with its proprietary Nova Pulse technology, a clean energy system that powered entire cities with unprecedented efficiency. He was a legend, a self-made billionaire who had risen from obscurity to dominate an industry. As Emily approached to refill his water glass, he was holding court, his voice sharp and commanding. As he addressed his guests, 3 investors whose tailored suits and nervous laughter marked them as men eager to please. "We'll start with the oysters, the ones with the mignonette, and bring a bottle of the 98 Chateau Lafite Langley," ordered, his eyes fixed on a point above Emily's head, as if she were part of the decor. "The real one, not that second-growth nonsense you tried to pass off last time." Emily nodded, her expression unchanged, despite the familiar sting of being dismissed. "Of course, sir," she said, her voice steady, though inside a quiet resentment simmered. She should have been designing fusion reactors, not serving them. As she turned to leave, Langley's tone shifted, taking on a theatrical flourish. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying over the restaurant's hum, "before we discuss the future of Langley Innovations, let me show you its past, the spark that started it all." He opened his portfolio with a flourish, pulling out a single laminated page and placing it on the table with the reverence of a priest handling a sacred relic. Emily paused, her hand still gripping the water pitcher. Her curiosity piqued despite herself. The page was old, its edges yellowed, covered in intricate equations, and a detailed schematic of a toroidal chamber lined with magnetic coils and particle accelerators, a design for a fusion energy device, elegant and revolutionary. It was the kind of work her mother used to sketch on napkins during breakfast, explaining plasma containment to a wide-eyed Emily as if it were a fairy tale. Langley tapped the page, his smile smug. 15 years ago, a moment of genius that became a trillion-dollar reality. The original Nova Pulse design. His guests leaned in, murmuring in awe, their forks forgotten. But Emily wasn't listening to them. Her eyes were locked on the bottom right corner of the page, where a signature stood out in bold, flowing cursive, Dr. Sarah Bennett. The world seemed to slow, the clatter of the restaurant fading into a distant roar. The pitcher in her hand felt impossibly heavy, her breath caught in her chest. That signature, she knew it as well as her own. It was on the birthday cards her mother had written on the margins of textbooks Emily still kept on the love notes tucked into her lunchbox as a child. It was the signature of a woman who had vanished, leaving a hole in Emily's life that had never healed. Her heart pounded, a cold certainty cutting through the fog of exhaustion. This wasn't a coincidence. Her mother had been working on fusion energy before she disappeared, a project she called Nova Pulse in the letters she'd sent home during her final months. Emily had always believed her mother's disappearance was more than an accident, that the official story was a lie. Now, here was proof staring up at her from a billionaire's portfolio. Langley's voice snapped her back to the present, sharp and impatient. "Mrs. My glass is empty." He gestured at his water glass without looking at her, his attention still on his guests. Emily stepped forward, her hands trembling slightly as she poured, her mind racing. She couldn't let this moment pass. She couldn't walk away from the truth. As she leaned in, she let her gaze linger on the schematic, memorizing its details, the curves of the coils, the precise annotations in her mother's handwriting. Then, with a voice she barely recognized as her own, she spoke clear and unwavering. "Sir, that's my mother's signature." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Langley froze his hand halfway to his glass, his eyes snapping to hers for the first time. For a split second his face was unguarded, a mask of shock, and something darker, fear, raw and primal, like a man caught in a lie he thought he'd buried forever. The investors stopped mid-sentence, their eyes darting between Emily and Langley. The restaurant's hum seemed to quiet heads turning at nearby tables. "What did you just say?" Langley's voice was low, almost a growl, his composure cracking. Emily pointed at the page, her finger steady despite the storm inside her. "That signature, Dr. Sarah Bennett. She was my mother. That's her work." Langley's shock morphed into a cold, controlled fury. He snatched the schematic from the table, shoving it back into his portfolio with a snap. "That's absurd," he said, his voice rising, edged with a defensive venom. "This is my design, my company's foundation. You're delusional." He stood towering over her, using his height to intimidate. "Caldwell," he barked, summoning the manager. Mr. Caldwell, a wiry man with a perpetually anxious demeanor, was already hurrying over, his face pale. "Mr. Langley, is there a problem?" he asked, his eyes pleading with Emily to stay silent. But she couldn't. 12 years of grief, of unanswered questions, of a truth she'd been told to accept without proof, surged within her. "He's lying," she said, her voice ringing through the restaurant. "That design, Nova Pulse? It was my mother's. She told me about it before she disappeared. This man stole it." The investors exchanged uneasy glances. One of them, a woman with sharp features, leaning forward, her eyes narrowing at Langley. His reaction was too visceral, too raw, for a simple misunderstanding. Langley's face flushed a sickly red. "This is harassment," he roared, slamming his hand on the table, sending a wine glass teetering. "Get this girl out of here! She's clearly unstable." Caldwell stepped between them, his hands raised placatingly. "Miss Harper, that's enough. You're upsetting our guests. Please, come with me." Emily stood her ground, her eyes locked on Langley's. "You can't hide the truth forever, Mr. Langley. I know what I saw." The restaurant was silent now, every eye on the confrontation. Caldwell's voice turned sharp. "Emily, you're done. Collect your things and leave. Now." 2 security guards appeared, their presence a silent threat. Emily felt the weight of the moment crash over her. Her job, her only means of supporting her father, was gone. But as the guards escorted her toward the staff exit, she saw the panic in Langley's eyes, the way his hands shook as he clutched his portfolio. He wasn't just a thief. He was hiding something much darker. The kitchen door swung shut behind her, cutting off the murmurs of the dining room. Emily stood in the clanging, steam-filled chaos of the kitchen, her apron suddenly feeling like a shackle. She was jobless, her father's next treatment due in days, but a fire had ignited within her. Langley's reaction wasn't one of innocence. It was guilt, raw and undeniable. She hurried to the staff locker room, ignoring the curious glances of her co-workers, and grabbed her coat and bag. Tucked inside was a small notebook, one of her mother's, that she always carried, a talisman of the life she'd lost. She flipped it open, her fingers trembling, and found a page she hadn't noticed before, a letter folded and yellowed addressed to her. "Emily, my star," it began in her mother's familiar script. "If you're reading this, I'm likely gone. The Nova Pulse Project is my life's work, a dream to power the world cleanly. Richard Langley was my partner, but I fear his ambition has outgrown his ethics. If anything happens to me, look for the truth in the work. It's all there." Emily's breath hitched. The letter was dated 2 weeks before her mother's disappearance. It wasn't proof, not yet, but it was a thread to pull a map to a truth she'd always known existed. As she stepped into the cold Boston night, the city's lights reflecting off the harbor, Emily felt a shift within her. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was the daughter of Dr. Sarah Bennett, and she had a mission to uncover what Richard Langley had done to find her mother and to reclaim the legacy that had been stolen. The bus ride home was a blur, the weight of her new reality pressing down. But beneath the fear and uncertainty, a cold resolve was taking root. She would find the truth, no matter the cost. Langley had built his empire on a lie, and Emily Harper was going to tear it down. The Boston dawn broke gray and heavy, the kind of morning that seemed to carry the weight of secrets. Emily Harper sat on the worn couch in her South Boston apartment, her mother's notebook open on her lap. The letter she'd found the night before, clutched in her hand like a lifeline. The words of Dr. Sarah Bennett looped through her mind. "If anything happens to me, look for the truth in the work." The apartment was quiet, except for the soft, rhythmic beeping of her father's medical monitor in the next room, a reminder of the fragile balance she was fighting to maintain. Michael Harper's illness had stolen his strength, leaving him confined to a bed or wheelchair most days, his once robust frame reduced to a shadow. Emily had spent the night sleepless, her mind racing with the image of Richard Langley's panicked eyes and that schematic bearing her mother's signature. The confrontation at the Golden Anchor had cost her job her only means of paying for her father's care, but it had also ignited a fire she hadn't felt since her MIT days. She wasn't just grieving anymore. She was angry, and that anger was a fuel she could use. The letter hinted at a betrayal, a partnership gone wrong, and Emily knew she couldn't unravel it alone. She needed someone who understood how to fight giants, someone who had faced Richard Langley and lived to tell the tale. By mid-morning, she was on a bus to Dorchester, a gritty neighborhood where the city's polish gave way to cracked sidewalks and faded storefronts. Her destination was a run-down apartment building home to Jack Sullivan, a former investigative journalist whose name she'd found in an old Boston Globe archive. Sullivan had once been a rising star, known for his relentless exposés on corporate corruption, until he'd taken aim at Langley Innovations 7 years ago and lost everything. The article she'd read on the library's computer was seared into her memory, a series of pieces questioning the origins of Langley's Nova Pulse technology, hinting at a shadow partner who had been erased from the company's history. The backlash had been swift and brutal. Langley's legal team buried Sullivan in lawsuits, painting him as a reckless liar chasing clout. His sources vanished, his career crumbled, and the Globe, facing financial ruin, had fired him and issued a retraction. Now Sullivan ran a small, cynical blog from his apartment, a shadow of his former self railing against the tech moguls who had crushed him. Emily had tracked him down through a comment he'd left on a tech forum, his address listed in a public directory. The building smelled of stale coffee and damp plaster, its hallways dim and peeling. She knocked on the door of apartment 3C, her heart pounding. The man who answered was in his late 30s with tired green eyes and a scruffy beard that hadn't seen a razor in days. He wore a faded Red Sox t-shirt and looked at her with a mix of suspicion and exhaustion. "Yeah," he said, his voice rough like he'd just woken up. "Are you Jack Sullivan?" Emily asked, gripping her tote bag, which held her mother's notebook and letter. He leaned against the door frame, sizing her up. "Depends. If you're selling something, I'm broke. If you're serving papers, leave 'em and go." Emily took a deep breath. "My name's Emily Harper. I read your articles about Richard Langley. You weren't wrong." His eyes narrowed, the exhaustion giving way to a flicker of interest, but also wariness. "That's ancient history. The world decided I was a liar. What do you want?" He started to close the door, but Emily stepped forward, her voice urgent. "Wait. I have proof. Langley stole my mother's work, Dr. Sarah Bennett. I saw her signature on his Nova Pulse schematic last night. He had me fired for calling him out." Sullivan paused, his hand still on the door. He studied her face, searching for a hint of deception, but found only a desperate sincerity. With a heavy sigh, he opened the door wider. "You've got 5 minutes, kid. Then I'm kicking you out." His apartment was a chaotic shrine to obsession. Every surface cluttered with stacks of newspapers, dog-eared books, and whiteboards covered in scribbled notes connected by red string. A massive board dominated the living room, pinned with articles, photos, and timelines, all centered on Langley innovations. "You're still investigating him," Emily said, her voice a mix of awe and realization. Sullivan snorted, clearing a pile of magazines off a chair for her. "Call it a bad habit, like collecting bottle caps, only less useful." He sat across from her, rubbing the back of his neck. "So, what's your story? Did Langley's factory poison your water, run over your dog?" Emily ignored his sarcasm and opened her tote bag, pulling out the letter and her mother's notebook. She placed them on the coffee table, her hands steady, despite the storm inside her. "My mother, Sarah Bennett, was a physicist. She was working on a fusion energy project called Nova Pulse before she disappeared 12 years ago. The police said it was an accident, but I never believed it. Last night at the restaurant where I worked, Langley showed off the original Nova Pulse schematic. It had her signature on it." Sullivan's eyebrows shot up, but he didn't interrupt. She pushed the letter toward him. "This is from her, dated 2 weeks before she vanished. She says Langley was her partner, but she didn't trust him. She thought he'd do something to her." Sullivan picked up the letter, his eyes scanning the elegant script. He flipped through the notebook, pausing at pages filled with equations and sketches that mirrored the schematic Emily had described. For a long moment, he was silent, his journalist's instincts stirring despite years of defeat. "This is interesting," he said, finally, his voice cautious, "but it's not enough. A letter and a signature don't take down a billionaire. Langley's got lawyers that eat people like us for breakfast." Emily leaned forward, her eyes fierce. "Then help me find more. You've been digging into him for years. You know where to look." Sullivan stood pacing the small apartment, his mind clearly racing. He stopped at his whiteboard, staring at a faded photo of a younger Richard Langley standing outside a nondescript building with a sign that read, "Bright Star Labs." "Your mother," he said, tapping the photo. "She worked with Langley at Bright Star, didn't she? A tech incubator that went bust 15 years ago. I found records of it when I was writing my articles, but most of the files were conveniently lost in a fire." He turned to her, his expression hardening. If she was part of that and her work became Nova Pulse, Langley didn't just steal an idea. He erased her. Emily nodded, her throat tight. "And I think he did more than that. I think he made her disappear." Sullivan's eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw a spark of the man he used to be, the crusader who'd once taken on titans. "Okay, Harper," he said, his voice low. "Let's say I believe you. What's next?" Emily pulled out her phone where she'd saved screenshots of old forum posts mentioning Bright Star Labs. We start here. This post mentions a technician named Clara Evans who worked at Bright Star. She might know something. Sullivan raised an eyebrow. You've done your homework. Clara Evans is a ghost now, no social media, no address. But I've got contacts who can find people like her. It'll take time. Emily's heart sank. Time was something she didn't have. Without her job, her father's next treatment was in jeopardy. But she nodded. Then we move fast. Over the next few days, Sullivan dusted off his old investigative playbook. He called in favors from former colleagues, scoured public records, and hacked into databases he hadn't touched in years. Emily, meanwhile, dove into her mother's notebook, deciphering the dense equations and notes about Nova Pulse. The project was a revolutionary approach to fusion energy using a unique magnetic confinement system to stabilize plasma at unprecedented efficiencies. Sarah's notes were filled with excitement, but also warnings. Richard wants to rush the prototype. He's talking to investors without me. I don't trust his intentions. The more Emily read, the clearer it became that her mother had been on the verge of a breakthrough when she vanished. Sullivan's contacts came through on the third day locating Clara Evans in a small town outside Concord, New Hampshire. She was retired, living quietly, but had once been a senior lab tech at Bright Star. Emily and Sullivan drove up in his beat-up sedan, the tension between them palpable. Sullivan was all business, his cynicism a shield, but Emily could sense his hunger for redemption. The drive was quiet, the New England countryside rolling past in a blur of autumn leaves and gray skies. Clara's house was a modest cottage, its garden overgrown but tidy. When she opened the door, she was a wiry woman in her late 60s, her eyes sharp with suspicion. "I don't talk to reporters," she said, starting to close the door. Emily stepped forward. "I'm not a reporter. I'm Emily Harper, Sarah Bennett's daughter." Clara froze, her hand trembling on the doorknob. "Sarah," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Come in." Inside Clara's living room was a time capsule of old tech shelves lined with circuit boards and manuals from the 90s. She sat them down, her hands fidgeting. "I knew this day would come," she said, her voice low. Sarah was the heart of Bright Star. She was brilliant, kind, always talking about how Nova Pulse could change the world. Langley was the money guy, charming, ruthless. He saw her work as his ticket to billions. Clara's story confirmed Emily's fears. Sarah had been the genius behind Nova Pulse, while Langley handled investors and business deals. As the project neared completion, Langley grew secretive, excluding Sarah from meetings and spreading rumors about her instability. Then one day, he announced she'd left the company after a breakdown. It was a lie, Clara said, her eyes glistening. Sarah was stressed, sure, but she was close to cracking the containment problem. The day she disappeared, I saw Langley arguing with her in the lab. He looked dangerous. Emily's heart pounded. "Did you see where she went?" Clara shook her head. "No, but I overheard Langley on the phone a week later talking about a discreet facility for problem cases. He mentioned Pine Hollow Retreat, a private sanitarium in Vermont. I thought it was for a client. But now—" Her voice trailed off, heavy with guilt. Sullivan leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "Clara, do you have anything from Bright Star documents, emails, anything to back this up?" Clara hesitated, then stood and retrieved a small metal box from a closet. Inside was a single flash drive. "I copied some of Sarah's files before the lab shut down. I don't know what's on it. My computer's too old to read it, but I kept it just in case." Emily's hands trembled as she took the drive. It was another piece of the puzzle, another step toward the truth. Back in Boston, Sullivan plugged the drive into his laptop, revealing a treasure trove of Sarah's notes, emails, and early Nova Pulse designs. One email sent to an unknown recipient stood out. "Richard is forging documents to claim full ownership. I'm scared he'll do whatever it takes to silence me." The email was dated 3 days before Sarah's disappearance. Sullivan whistled low. "This is a smoking gun, Harper. But we need more to tie Langley to her disappearance." Emily nodded, her mind racing. Pine Hollow Retreat was their next lead, but getting there would be dangerous. Langley's influence was vast, and he'd already proven he'd do anything to protect his secrets. That night, as Emily returned to her apartment, she found the lock broken, the door ajar. Her heart sank as she stepped inside. The place had been trashed, not robbed, but searched. Her father's medical supplies were untouched, but her mother's notebook was gone, pages torn and scattered. A note was pinned to the fridge with a knife. "Stop digging, or you'll end up like her." Fear gripped her, but it was quickly overtaken by a blazing defiance. Langley wasn't just hiding a theft. He was hiding a crime, and he was scared. Emily called Sullivan, her voice steady despite the shaking in her hands. They broke in. They took the notebook. Sullivan's response was immediate. "Get out of there. Meet me at my place." "We're not stopping now." As Emily grabbed her coat and fled into the night, the weight of her mother's letter in her pocket, she knew they were closing in on something massive. Langley had built his empire on her mother's genius, and he'd do anything to keep it buried. But Emily Harper wasn't invisible anymore. She was a hunter, and the truth was her prey. The rain fell in a relentless drizzle over the dark wooded hills of Vermont, cloaking the night in a damp, oppressive silence. Emily Harper crouched in the underbrush. Her black hoodie soaked through her heart, hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The Pine Hollow Retreat loomed ahead, its sleek modern facade a stark contrast to the dense forest surrounding it. From a distance, it looked like a luxury spa with its manicured lawns and softly lit windows, but Emily knew better. It was a fortress, a gilded cage designed to keep secrets locked away. The flash drive from Clara Evans burned a metaphorical hole in her pocket. Its contents, her mother's emails, designs, and warnings about Richard Langley, fueling her resolve. Jack Sullivan, her unlikely ally, was parked a mile down a muddy logging trail in a rented SUV, his laptop screen casting a faint glow as he monitored a police scanner and a hacked feed from the facility's perimeter cameras. Their plan was desperate, bordering on reckless, but it was their only shot. Emily had to get inside Pine Hollow, find her mother, Dr. Sarah Bennett, and get proof that she was alive. The thought of her mother lost for 12 years, locked away while Langley built an empire on her stolen work, drove Emily forward, despite the fear clawing at her chest. The old HVAC schematics Sullivan had pulled from county archives were their key, a forgotten ventilation duct in the facility's original wing, too outdated to be monitored by the high-tech security grid. Emily adjusted the tiny earpiece Jack had given her, her breath shallow. "Jack!" "I'm at the duct," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the patter of rain. "Copy that." Jack's voice crackled back, steady but tense. "You've got 25 minutes before the next patrol sweep. Get in. Get the proof. Get out. Don't play hero." Emily nodded to herself, her fingers brushing the multi-tool in her pocket. "Got it. Going in." The ventilation duct was hidden behind a tangle of brambles, its rusted grate barely visible in the moonlight. Emily worked quickly, her hands steady despite the cold, unscrewing the bolts with the multi-tool. The grate came free with a groan, and she slipped inside, the metal cold and slick against her palms. The duct was claustrophobic, barely wide enough for her shoulders, the air thick with the smell of mold and rust. She crawled forward, her flashlight's thin beam cutting through the darkness, cobwebs clinging to her face like ghostly fingers. Every scrape of her knees echoed in the tight space, amplifying her fear that someone would hear. Her mother's letter echoed in her mind. Look for the truth in the work. Emily clung to those words, each one a tether, pulling her deeper into the dragon's lair. After what felt like an eternity, she reached a junction where the duct widened, leading to a grate overlooking a dimly lit basement. She peered through the slats, her heart racing. Below was a maze of pipes and electrical boxes, the hum of machinery vibrating through the concrete floor. "I'm in the basement," she whispered into her earpiece. "Copy," Jack replied. "Find maintenance stairway B. It'll take you to the secure wing. Be careful, orderlies patrol every 30 minutes." Emily pried open the grate, her arms trembling from the effort, and lowered herself into the basement, landing softly on the cold floor. The air was heavy with the sharp scent of disinfectant, a stark contrast to the damp earth outside. She moved quickly, her sneakers silent against the concrete, following the faded stencils on the walls toward Stairway B. The Pine Hollow retreat was a paradox, a place of sterile beauty hiding a sinister purpose. The basement gave way to a polished marble hallway, its walls painted a soothing ivory, the lighting soft and indirect. It felt like a hospital designed by a five-star hotel, but the heavy oak doors lining the corridor told a different story. Each had a reinforced glass window and a slot for meal trays, their numbers etched in discreet brass plates. This was the high-security wing, where the wealthy paid to keep their problems out of sight. Emily's pulse quickened as she moved from door to door, peering through the windows. In one, an elderly man stared blankly at a wall, his hands folded in his lap. In another, a woman paced in circles, muttering to herself. Each face was a reminder of the lives hidden here, their stories silenced by money and power. "Jack, I'm in the secure wing," she whispered. "It's too quiet." Jack's voice was sharp. "That's the point. Patients here are kept sedated, isolated. Check the rooms, but hurry. You've got 15 minutes left." Emily's hands shook as she continued, her flashlight casting long shadows. Room 108 empty. Room 109, a sleeping figure under a blanket. Then she reached room 110. She pressed her face to the glass, and her world stopped. The room was sparse. A single bed, a small table, a chair bolted to the floor. A woman sat at the table, her back to the door, her thinning hair streaked with gray. She was writing in a small notebook, her movements slow, deliberate, as if each stroke of the pen required immense effort. Emily's breath caught her hand trembling as she raised her flashlight. The woman turned slightly, her profile illuminated by the dim glow of a bedside lamp. The high cheekbones, the gentle curve of her jaw. It was older, worn by years of captivity, but unmistakable. It was Dr. Sarah Bennett, her mother. A sob rose in Emily's throat, and she clapped a hand over her mouth to stifle it. Tears blurred her vision. After 12 years of grief, of believing her mother was gone here, she was alive, but a shadow of the vibrant woman Emily remembered. "Jack," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I found her. It's Mom." Jack's voice was steady, an anchor in her storm. "Okay, Emily, stay calm. Get a picture. You need proof." Emily fumbled for the burner phone in her pocket, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped it. She had to get her mother's face, something undeniable. She tapped lightly on the glass, the sound barely audible. "Mom," She breathed, her voice a desperate whisper. Sarah flinched, her head turning slowly, her eyes clouded and distant as if peering through a fog. There was a flicker of confusion, a ghost of recognition, but it was buried under years of sedation. "Mom, it's me, Emily," she whispered, pressing her palm against the cold glass. Sarah's brow furrowed her hand, pausing over the notebook. For a moment, her eyes seemed to focus, searching Emily's face, as if trying to pull a memory from the depths. Emily raised the phone, snapping a photo through the glass, a clear shot of her mother's face, the proof they needed. A sudden clang echoed down the hallway, a metal door slamming shut. "Emily," moved Jack's voice hissed in her ear. "Patrol's coming early. Get out, now." Panic seized her, her heart lurching. She couldn't leave her mother, not after finding her, but if she was caught, the photo would be taken and they'd both be lost. "I love you, Mom," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I'm coming back, I swear." Sarah's hand rose trembling and pressed against the glass, mirroring Emily's. Her lips moved, forming a single word, "Emily," before her eyes clouded again. Emily tore herself away, her chest aching, and sprinted back toward the maintenance stairway. Her footsteps echoed in the silent corridor, each one a betrayal, as she left her mother behind. She plunged into the basement, the labyrinth of pipes closing around her like a trap. Halfway to the ventilation duct, she heard voices, low, urgent, the clipped tones of security guards. "Check the West Wing," one said. Something tripped the motion sensor. Emily's heart stopped. She ducked behind a stack of crates, her breath ragged, and waited until the voices faded. "Jack, they're close," she whispered. "Keep moving," he urged. "You're almost there." She scrambled to the duct, hoisting herself inside with a strength born of desperation. The crawlback was a nightmare, the metal walls pressing in her flashlight, flickering as the battery weakened. Every second felt like an eternity, the fear of capture a weight on her chest. When she finally tumbled out into the wet, cold woods, she gasped for air, her body shaking uncontrollably. She ran, stumbling through the undergrowth, until she saw the faint outline of Jack's SUV. She wrenched open the door and collapsed into the passenger seat, soaked and trembling. The burner phone clutched in her hand like a lifeline. "I got it," she gasped, holding up the phone. "I got the proof." Jack's face was grim, but his eyes softened as he saw her state. He reached over, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. "You did good, kid. You're okay." Emily shook her head, tears mixing with the rain on her face. "She's in there, Jack. She recognized me, but she's broken. They've kept her drugged for years." Jack started the car, pulling onto the logging trail. "We've got the photo, Emily. That's enough to start something. But we need to be smart. Langley's not going to let this go." As they drove through the dark, Emily stared at the phone. The image of her mother's face burned into her mind. The woman in room 110 was a ghost of the scientist who'd taught her to dream, but she was alive. That was enough for now. But the mission wasn't over. As they sped back to Boston, Emily's fear began to harden into something else: resolve. Langley had taken 12 years from her mother, from her family. He'd built a fortune on a lie, and now he was using her mother's work for something darker. Emily wasn't just fighting for justice anymore. She was fighting for her mother's life. Back in Jack's apartment, they uploaded the photo to his encrypted laptop, the grainy image a stark testament to their discovery. But as Jack reviewed the files from Clara's flash drive, he froze, his face paling. "Emily, you need to see this." He turned the screen toward her, revealing a hidden folder buried in the drive's data. It contained schematics, not for clean energy, but for a weaponized version of Nova Pulse, a compact, high-yield energy device capable of catastrophic destruction. Sarah's notes were scrawled in the margins. Richard wants to sell this to military contractors. I refused. He won't stop. Emily's blood ran cold. Langley wasn't just a thief. He was a monster twisting her mother's dream into a nightmare. He's been using her work to build weapons, she said, her voice trembling with rage, and keeping her locked away to cover it up. Jack nodded, his jaw tight. This changes everything. We're not just exposing a theft. We're exposing a crime against humanity. Emily looked at the photo of her mother, the frail figure in room 110, and felt a fire ignite within her. They had proof, but it wasn't enough to free Sarah. They needed to bring Langley down, and they needed to do it fast. The rain outside Jack's window mirrored the storm in Emily's heart. She wasn't a waitress anymore, nor just a daughter searching for answers. She was a warrior, and the battle had just begun. The fluorescent lights of Jack Sullivan's cluttered Dorchester apartment buzzed faintly, casting a stark glow over the chaos of papers, whiteboards, and coffee mugs that had become their war room. Emily Harper sat hunched over Jack's laptop, her eyes burning from hours of staring at the screen. The grainy photo of her mother, Dr. Sarah Bennett, in room 110 of Pine Hollow Retreat, still seared into her mind. The image was their trump card proof that Sarah was alive, locked away for 12 years, while Richard Langley built his empire on her stolen Nova Pulse technology. Jack paced behind her, his phone pressed to his ear, his voice low and urgent, as he spoke to a contact at the Boston Globe, a former colleague who still owed him a favor. The flash drive from Clara Evans lay on the table, its contents a damning archive of Sarah's designs, emails, and notes revealing Langley's betrayal and his chilling plan to weaponize her work. The air was thick with tension, the weight of what they were about to do pressing down on them. Emily's hands trembled as she typed, helping Jack draft the article that could topple a billionaire. They had the photo, Clara's testimony, and the forged documents from Sarah's files, but they were racing against time. Langley's goons had already broken into Emily's apartment, leaving a threatening note, and Jack's blog had been hit with cyber attacks, crashing it twice in the past day. They were being watched, hunted, and every move felt like a step closer to a precipice. But Emily wasn't backing down. She'd seen her mother's face, felt the faint spark of recognition through the glass, and she knew this wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about bringing Sarah home. Jack hung up the phone, his face grim but determined. "It's done," he said, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "My contact at the Globe is taking the story. They're running it tomorrow morning, front page with the photo and Clara's affidavit. We've got a shot to blow this wide open." Emily nodded, her throat tight. The article was a masterpiece of investigative journalism, a narrative that wove together Sarah's brilliance, Langley's betrayal, and the horrific truth of her imprisonment. It detailed the forged partnership dissolution agreement that stripped Sarah of her work, the emails warning of Langley's ambition, and the weaponized Nova Pulse designs that threatened global security. Jack had titled it, "The Stolen Genius: How Richard Langley Built an Empire on a Lie." The photo of Sarah, gaunt but undeniably alive, was the linchpin, a visual that no one could ignore. "What happens next?" Emily asked, her voice steady, despite the fear gnawing at her. Jack sat across from her, his eyes intense. "The story goes live at 6 a.m. Langley will try to spin it, but the evidence is too strong. The feds will have to move on Pine Hollow. If they find Sarah, it's over for him." Emily's mind flashed to her mother's frail figure, the way her hand had pressed against the glass, mirroring her own. "And if they don't," she whispered, Jack's jaw tightened. Then we keep fighting. But we've got him cornered, Emily. He's not getting out of this. The next morning, Boston woke to a bombshell. The Globe's front page screamed the headline in bold letters, the photo of Sarah Bennett splashed across it, her tired eyes a silent accusation. Social media erupted with, "Where is Sarah Bennett?" trending globally within hours. Langley Innovation stock plummeted in pre-market trading, wiping out billions in value before the opening bell. News vans swarmed the company's sleek headquarters in Cambridge, and protesters gathered outside Pine Hollow Retreat, demanding answers. Emily watched the chaos unfold on Jack's ancient TV, her heart pounding. Her father Michael sat beside her in his wheelchair, his frail hand gripping hers. "You did this, Emily," he said, his voice weak but proud. "You found her." Emily shook her head, tears pricking her eyes. "Not yet, Dad, but I will." Langley issued a statement through his PR team calling the article a vicious smear campaign orchestrated by a disgraced journalist and a disturbed former waitress. He denied knowing Sarah Bennett, claiming the signature on the Nova Pulse schematic was a coincidence, a clerical error from a defunct lab. But his words rang hollow against the weight of the evidence, and the public wasn't buying it. By noon, federal agents armed with a warrant based on Jack's article raided Pine Hollow Retreat. Emily and Jack watched the live coverage from a coffee shop, too paranoid to stay in one place. The news chopper's footage showed agents storming the facility, their black SUVs clogging the rural road. Emily's phone buzzed with a text from Jack's contact at the Globe. "They found her. She's alive." Emily's breath caught a sob escaping her lips. Jack put a hand on her shoulder, his own eyes glistening. "You did it, kid," he said softly. "You brought her back." The reunion took place in a secure hospital room in Burlington, Vermont, far from the cameras and chaos. Emily walked in, her heart in her throat, to find Sarah sitting up in bed, an IV dripping fluids to counteract years of sedation. She was thinner than in the photo, her face etched with lines of sorrow, but her eyes, those sharp, brilliant eyes, were clear for the first time in over a decade. "Emily," Sarah whispered, her voice hoarse, but filled with love. Emily rushed to her side, wrapping her arms around her mother, the years of grief and loss melting away in their embrace. Michael was wheeled in moments later, his own tears falling, as he reached for Sarah's hand. "I never stopped believing," he said, his voice breaking. The family sat together, holding each other, the weight of 12 stolen years heavy, but no longer crushing. Sarah was weak, her mind still piecing itself back together, but she was alive, and that was enough. She told them fragments of her story, how Langley had drugged her during a meeting, how she'd woken up in Pine Hollow labeled as unstable, her protests dismissed as delusions. He took everything she said, her voice trembling. "But he didn't take you." Emily squeezed her hand, her resolve hardening. The fight wasn't over. Langley was still out there, and the truth needed to be fully exposed. Richard Langley's downfall was as swift as it was spectacular. He was arrested that evening at a private airfield, caught trying to board a jet to a non-extradition country. The evidence was overwhelming: the photo, Clara's affidavit, the forged documents, and now Pine Hollow's records, which revealed illegal medical practices funded by Langley's shell companies. The facility's staff, facing their own charges, turned on him, providing financial trails that linked directly to his accounts. The weaponized Nova Pulse designs were the final nail, sparking a federal investigation into Langley Innovations' military contracts. The company filed for bankruptcy within days, its assets frozen as lawsuits piled up. Langley was charged with kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, fraud, and violations of national security laws. His trial was a media circus, but the outcome was never in doubt. He was convicted on all counts, his empire reduced to ashes. For Emily, the victory was bittersweet. The world now knew her mother's name, but the years they'd lost could never be regained. Yet from those ashes, something new began to grow. With Sarah's patents rightfully restored, Emily and her mother founded Bennett Energy Solutions, a company dedicated to realizing Sarah's original vision for Nova Pulse: clean, sustainable energy for all. Jack Sullivan joined the board, his reputation not just restored, but elevated to legendary status. His article had won awards, and he was back at the Globe writing with a fire he thought he'd lost. Emily, once a waitress struggling to survive, stepped into the role of CEO, her MIT-honed mind finding new purpose. She wasn't just leading a company, she was building a legacy. One of their first acts was to establish the Sarah Bennett Foundation, a nonprofit that used Nova Pulse technology to bring affordable energy to underserved communities. Emily stood at a press conference 6 months later, her parents by her side announcing the foundation's first project, a solar fusion hybrid plant for a rural town in Appalachia. "This is for my mother," she said, her voice steady, "and for everyone who's been told their dreams don't matter." Sarah, still recovering but growing stronger every day, smiled at her daughter, her pride palpable. "You were always my star," she whispered later as they stood in a lab looking at a new Nova Pulse prototype. Sarah pointed to a screen displaying a revised containment equation. "I worked on this in my head all those years in that room. I never stopped." Emily hugged her, tears in her eyes. "We're finishing it together now, Mom." The story of Emily Harper is more than a tale of triumph over a corporate titan. It's a lesson in the power of perseverance, truth, and love. Emily could have accepted her mother's disappearance, could have let grief and circumstance define her, but she chose to fight. She chose to believe in a truth no one else saw, to risk everything for a woman the world had forgotten. Her journey teaches us that no one is truly invisible. Every voice, no matter how small, can spark change. It reminds us that integrity matters, that standing up to power, even when it seems impossible, can reshape the world. For those listening, let Emily's story inspire you to hold fast to your principles, to fight for those you love, and to never let your circumstances dictate your future. The truth, no matter how deeply buried, will always find a way to the light. Emily Harper proved that, and so can you. Share this story not just for its drama, but for its call to action, to be brave, to be true, and to keep pushing forward no matter the odds.